name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 6th Sunday of Easter for the week of May 10th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast. Happy Mother's Day if you're here in the United States. I know that's a big day, especially kind of bringing people together and thinking about their mom. But I, at the start here, have to kind of state a few things. I've kind of been referencing that I've been kind of going through some stuff. And last week, on the 27th of April, my wife's grandmother passed away. And it's been a long journey. She's lived a great life. And she's one of those people that the more I got to know her, the more I admired things about her. She was very much adamant about talking to people about Jesus. She figured out ways of doing evangelism in ways that I would never think of, like painting her nails to be able to talk about Jesus. And there were definitely things where theologically, maybe we were a little bit different at times. But it was also one of those moments too, where you would recognize the beauty of what Christ did in her life and her husband's life, who passed away long before I ever got to meet them, and realizing and understanding what God can do for people and looking at the impact that that's had on my wife and how she grew up and her whole family. And for me, I just feel like I need to take a moment and at least honor that. So Francis Valenzuela, you will be greatly missed. And thank you for teaching me the amazing ways that you showed others Jesus in ways that I wouldn't normally think about it. So thank you. Now, there's also some other things we need to kind of get into, a little bit of early housekeeping here on the show. There was a listener who reached out to me a little while ago, and I've been able to, over the last week, finally get to some of it. And his name is Esong, and he's a student in Cameroon and wrote an essay called Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet. It's definitely more of an essay, and he states that himself, but kind of talking about how, in their opinion, they do not see that faith and science should be this conflict, but instead working together. And I really enjoyed reading through this essay. I'm going to link it in the show notes from here on out for the foreseeable future. I know they're working on another essay, and I'm really excited to see that. But it's a really great work. It's really great to kind of put it into simplistic terms. It's definitely not like super scientific deep, but more kind of going on a broad summary level, but it's still really great. And I've had some interaction back and forth. He did a great job, and I just really want to thank him for reaching out to talking to me about this. And I definitely want to make sure that people check that out. That'll be also down in the show notes in the references section, and I'll make sure that's a little more prominent this week, but make sure to check that out. But before we get into this week, we also need to look back onto last week's question, which was, where have you been transformed through Easter? And transitions are always an amazing point for us to kind of be looking at and doing that. And I've been watching that with my wife and her family. I definitely have felt Easter very differently based off of what's been going on this year, as you kind of can now understand at a deeper level. And there is transformation within that. I think as we move through different phases of life, it can also move us into different types of transformation that comes from that. And I think that's something that we don't often talk about enough as we get older, especially as we get toward like retirement and moving into that next phase of life after that, and the things that come and go with that. And so I think there's a lot of transition that happens in life, and us being able to acknowledge it, recognize it, and embrace it, I think is a key part of Easter and a key part of faith and a key part of life in general, that we need to be okay with transition, no matter how difficult that may seem. So let's just jump into it here this week. The first reading is out of Acts chapter 17, verses 22 to 31. This is where Paul kind of throws some big haymakers, I feel, this week in this text. We have Paul standing in front of Areopagus, and he's in Athens. And before approaching this crowd, he has kind of gone through the city market, and there were these idols that were to all these different people. and including one to the unknown God. And this is where Paul kind of reaches out and kind of talks about this a little bit deeper in the aspect of you have so many gods that you have to have a deity to somebody who you're not even sure who they are. And thus, we have this faith in a God that is all-encompassing, and we know exactly who they are. We are the offspring of the true God, and that they are watching over us, they are taking care of us, they are interacting with us, we are together interacting consistently. And thus, in that we are able to move forward and we are able to grow in this relationship because we aren't trying to make sure we're touching everybody. We know exactly who we are reaching out for. The psalm that goes with that then, Psalm 66, verses 8 to 20. And this is a psalm of recognition that God has blessed us, that God continues to help us get stronger within our faith. I really like here as we look at specifically like verse 10, you have tested us, you have tried us as silver is tried. This idea of purification, this process of continually bringing out more of the impurities within us to be more like God. And thus, in this, that we become closer and closer to God, and we have the healthy fear of God, and thus we are able to actually listen closer to what God is saying, being able to better embody who God is wanting us to be, and better be reflections of who God is wanting us to reflect God's self into God's creation, being able to recognize that, acknowledging that, and seeing that in and around us. The second reading or the epistle text this week is out of 1 Peter chapter 3, starting at verse 13 to 22. This then is this acknowledgement of how we are trying to become closer to who we are in Christ, and that God continues to work with us and is transformed through us as we are continuing to seek this out. We are recognizing that God is going through this process of purification for us. And that's part of what baptism is, acknowledging that commitment and that process to continually be renewing ourselves to be closer to who God is as we are going through this purification. But it's also recognizing what Christ did for us and this recognition of Christ suffering on our behalf. And that's not just something that we're putting to the side. This is something that we're acknowledging. And we're also recognizing that God is continuing to be in and amongst us and around us and is being out in front of us in certain ways as well, walking alongside us, but also keeping an eye beyond what we can see in front of us to make sure that we are okay. So this recognition on how God kind of is surrounding us and walking with us as we are going through life. The gospel text then this week is out of John chapter 14, starting at verse 15 to 21. Now, this is continuing in the farewell discourse that we've been going through with John. And this is, again, that we are given this commandment to love. And then we are getting told that we will have another advocate who is going to come and be amongst us, even though that Christ is only going to be physically with us for a period of time, that this advocate will not be abandoning us. And then we get here at the very end, they who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me, and those who love me are loved by my Father, and I love them, and they reveal myself to them. This recognition on how the love that God has for us is continue to be around us. Jesus is stating that there's going to be an advocate so that we're not abandoned, but we're continued to be in this relationship with God. And that even though that Jesus isn't physically there, the connection and way to be able to relate and work together is still there, and that we need to continue to embrace that wholeheartedly. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, I have to do a shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, being able to look at many years of commentaries, being able to go through podcasts of listening through and hearing different ideas, even having different sections on if you are more of a preacher, going through and thinking about some different preacher ideas over there, some great ideas, along with just being able to dig into the text and hearing it from some great biblical scholars. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week over here, but also having art, prayers, hymns, daily devotions. Whether you are going to be in front of the pews or in the pews, I think it's really important to be spending some time in preparing you for that experience. So I'd highly recommend checking this resource out at the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. It is an amazing resource that I don't think we utilize probably nearly enough. Like I stated, I'd also highly recommend checking out Esong's essay, and that will be the second link down in the references section down below. But I'd also highly recommend checking out the Greenblades Teaching Roundtable and the Greenblades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies for the weekly lectionary, very similar to this, or a monthly newsletter that brings that in along with some other resources, events, and notices, some green notes, some different things to be thinking a little bit more ecologically. So if you enjoy kind of thinking about these topics and enjoy listening to this podcast for half an hour each week, I highly recommend checking those resources out and maybe looking at it from more of an environmental standpoint. And that would be a great resource for you. So check out the Greenblades Preaching Roundtable and the Greenblades Rising publication. The idea of advocate or helper is sometimes hard for us to get our heads around. This recognition on how something is there, but it's also not there, and yet it's making up a huge aspect of what is going on, but yet we don't see it physically. So sometimes it's hard, and it gets us back to kind of like what we heard a few weeks ago with Thomas of blessed are those who come to believe without seeing, per se. This recognition on how there is so much at times of what we have seen or what we see becomes embodied within us of how faith is. But we also then have to acknowledge and recognize that there are certain things that we don't see, but yet that we can still see that God is doing some of that. That God has sent an advocate. God has sent things in process for us. And I would argue this week, as I was going through this and looking at it, I think our immune system is another example on how Christ was stating, I have sent an advocate on my behalf for you. So let's go through this process a little bit. First and foremost, your first line of defense for your body is your skin and mucuses. And a lot of these different things are trying to help capture different things that are in the air, different viruses, different bacterias, to be able to prevent them from going into your body and making you sick. And what we then have is when something comes into the body, we start having dendrite cells being able to try to attach to it and recognize something's not right here. And it goes into these phase of, okay, what do we need to do? So we have T cells and we have B cells are the big two that we're going to be talking about this week, both of which are fairly intensive processes, especially T cells. T cells are made in your bone marrow and they have like quite the rigorous protocol to be able to fully become T cells. Essentially, they have to pass some tests. And if the body decides that they aren't up to snuff, it will kill them off before they ever really did anything to start over. They need where your body is able to work with these cells at a 95 plus percentile success rate. And what T cells are trying to do is at the bare minimum, being able to recognize what is you and what isn't you. What is your own cells and what isn't your own cells. So when these dendrites are putting things out, it starts to bring on different immune responses. And so thus we have these helper T cells to go out to start to see if there's something that they can do. And now granted, in certain ways, the helper Ts really don't do that much. They're essentially, think of it as the coordination of the attack of what needs to happen. And they go in and, okay, this isn't us, but we aren't sure how we should respond to this. But we know that something is wrong. And I would argue in certain ways, this is kind of like the Holy Spirit for us, that it's going out there, it's recognizing that something is wrong, and then it's making this call to, okay, then what should we be doing? Trying to guide us into the right steps. And that's where I would argue the B cells are a little bit more like Christ and a little bit more like what we're expecting. The B cells are kind of the heavy artillery within the body of, okay, if something's going on, we're going to take it out. And in that process, then they have very specific keys to be able to identify, okay, this is a virus that we are familiar with, and thus this is how we handle it. And so thus, when that happens, it pulls out the heavy guns per se, it figures out ways to kill the cell, and then it's lock that into memory, so thus it can be repeated. This is the whole idea behind vaccines per se, that we are introducing the virus or bacteria at super low levels, that it might make you feel slightly ill, but below the threshold that it's going to do anything. And essentially is training these B cells and T cells, we'll get into that in a moment, on what's going on so that the body is able to respond quicker and is being able to already know what it needs to do to attack these bugs. But what is happening then when the B cells are creating the key per se on, okay, this is what this is. So it's making a specific key to recognize this is this type of virus or type of bacteria, and thus this is what we are doing to handle this. And that's going to be, as it's doing that and going through replication, it is then sending that instruction out. These B cells are super specialized. All the B cells that come from that B cell is going to be specifically targeting that bacteria, that virus, whatever it is. This is the instructions on how to do that. This is the heavy artillery on how we take care of this. And this is exactly why we do what we do with vaccines, because we are then training so that we have these B cells, that they have the instructions, they have the keys, they know exactly what to do. They don't have to be figuring it out. And there is this process where they are slowly figuring out which artillery to be using, what is the key to exactly identify whatever the intruder is per se. We have the T cells that, as they are going through replication, they are creating multiple different types of T cells. There's memory T cells, there are helper T cells, but this recognition on being able to acknowledge and figure out like which types of maybe B cells that they're trying to bring in for these different types of viruses as it's learning these different things, going back and forth. What we can kind of see more with going back to the B cells is it's more of a sacrifice. It is going to go in to take this on for the body. It is going to do what it needs to do to take care of it. Where the T cells, per se, are helping the body to be able to acknowledge something is going on, we're needing additional help. They're signaling to the body, they're starting to ramp different things up to make sure that the body is able to handle it. They're starting to bring in the artillery. It's calling for the B cells to come in. And to me, in a lot of ways, that sounds like an advocate to come in and start to acknowledge that, okay, something's not right here. We're needing additional support. We're needing additional help. I'm setting out the calls for the B cells to come in to help take care of this. Us having this type of system built into us, that we're having these helper T cells making calls to B cells, and then they're going to lock these into their prospective memories on how to be able to make the connections and how they're going to be able to make those calls and how are they going to react to these different viruses is significant. And even on top of that, there are specific T cells to also coordinate to make sure that as the situation is diminishing, that they're not overcalling more and more and more support to the point where then the body is attacking itself because it has all this support system. There's also regulatory T cells. So as the body then has called the helper Ts to essentially help coordinate, they have the cytotoxin T cells, which are also kind of helping to take care of some of the different viruses and stuff as well. Not as much as the B cells that are a little bit more specialized, but to take on some more of the different things going on within the body. There's also these regulatory T cells, which what they're doing is, okay, we have enough support. We're taking care of this to make sure that we don't oversupply so that the body starts attacking itself and causing more of a civil war. And this is where sometimes autoimmune diseases can come into play, where your regulatory T cells aren't quite working the way that they're supposed to in certain situations. As we are thinking about this, though, it's this recognition then in all of this that we have a system that is set up to make sure that, one, we're not putting time and effort into things that we don't need to be putting time and effort into. We're having checks and balances, per se, to make sure that we are only attacking foreign invaders within our body. We're not going to go and just be attacking ourselves for the sake of hurting ourselves. And in certain ways, I would argue that's a little bit of what Paul is getting at in the Acts text, where this idea of having this personal connection with God means that we don't need to be constantly looking for other gods, constantly looking for other ways to connect. We are recognizing this is our God. This is who God is. We recognize the character of who God is, that we are connecting with God. In that, it leads us to the psalm where we are being refined as we are connecting and communicating with God. We are learning more and more of what the B cells can do. We are learning the different specialties of all the different B cells that are floating and waiting for their moment to shine, and recognizing how they are willing to sacrifice themselves to take this stuff on for the body and continue to make sure that there's copies put out there for us. And thus, this is the recognition that we should be proclaiming this and recognizing how amazing this actually is. And it is this recognition that we see then in John that we aren't abandoned. We have been literally set up in our eternal body with immune systems to make sure that we are not alone, that all the things that we have experienced even before we were born is still embedded within our DNA, embedded in those B cells, so that it knows how to attack. It knows what it needs to do. It has the magic bullet to take out certain viruses because we've gone through it before. And thus, as we've talked about multiple times, this is part of the reason for vaccines, to put it in at low levels so that the body learns and is able to attack effectively. Within a world that is feeling more and more lonely, feeling less and less connected, I think this type of text and even recognizing what is going on within our body and how interconnected it is more and more important. It shows that we are designed in recognizing that we are meant to be in community. We are meant to be sharing these experiences together. We are meant to be walking through things together. We are meant to handle this together. Part of why I tell you what some of the different things that have been going on in my personal life is because we are walking through this together. There are going to be times that hopefully I am able to uplift you and help carry you at different times. And there's going to be times that you are going to do that for me. And we are mimicking what Christ has done for us. We are not abandoned. We are instead part of a much deeper community. And we're seeing how interconnected it is within our immune system. But as we start looking for these connections, we start seeing how interconnected our whole world really is. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you see an advocate or helper for something out in the world that you notice? Where do you see a helper or advocate out in the world? And it could be a person or it could be something else, something that is helping or leading the way. I know for me, another one that I like going to in certain ways is the sun for birds. As it gives and it leads the way that there's more and more sunshine, there's more and more warmth as the globe is slightly tilted toward it. In the summer months, whether you are in the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, there are months that are more summer-like. But then as that sun is disappearing, it is being an advocate and telling those birds it's time to migrate. It's time to go somewhere else. It's going to get colder. The days are going to get shorter. There isn't going to be as much life here. I think we have to be willing to acknowledge those. And once we acknowledge those, I think it becomes easier to start seeing that and understanding within ourselves that we need to embody that. Because that's a major part of the faith, is this recognition that God is taking care of us, that God is there for us, that God has sent an advocate for us to help us. And we then also have to be willing to accept those calls for help. We have to be willing to ask for help. We have to be willing to acknowledge the help. And like we've stated before, it puts aside the image of strapping yourself up by the bootstraps, instead for an image of recognizing all the people that were there to help build the boots, to help build the straps, to help build the laces, to help teach you to tie. All those people that helped you get to that process to be able to tighten those bootstraps. It's an important part of the faith. And if we don't acknowledge those people, I think there's an aspect that we have missed out on certain things of the faith. And that's unfortunate, because now we can really see that it's literally embedded into our bodies. We have helpers within our bodies, so thus we should be helpers and looking for helpers as well. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.